My name is Margot, am 32 years old, and I never thought I'd see my brother-in-law Derek standing in my corporate law office, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. 6 months had passed since my family excluded me from Thanksgiving. 6 months since they decided I wasn't worth their time because I refused to hand over my inheritance to save my father's failing construction business. Derek is married to my younger sister Paige, the golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Now here he was, hands trembling as he gripped the edge of my desk, and the first words out of his mouth made my blood run cold. Margot, I made a terrible mistake, and Paige doesn't know I'm here. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. If you've ever felt like the black sheep in your family, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And please subscribe, because this story takes some wild turns you won't want to miss. Trust me, what my family did next will shock you. Now, let's get into what happened when my entire world flipped upside down. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I always knew I was different from my sister Paige. Our father Russell owned a construction company that did well enough to keep us in a comfortable upper-middle-class neighborhood, with good schools and annual vacations to the coast. My mother Lorraine worked as a real estate agent, always impeccably dressed and concerned with what the neighbors thought about our family. Paige, who's 4 years younger than me, seemed to understand instinctively how to win our parents' approval in ways I never could. She was bubbly and social, always surrounded by friends, captain of the cheerleading squad, homecoming princess. I spent my teenage years with my nose buried in books, dreaming of getting into a good college and building a life based on my own achievements, rather than my ability to charm people at dinner parties. The divide between us grew wider as we got older. Paige married her high school sweetheart Derek when she was just 23, right after she finished her associate degree at community college. Our parents threw them an elaborate wedding that must have cost $40,000, with 200 guests and a reception at the nicest venue in town. Meanwhile, I had spent those years grinding through law school, taking on massive student loans because our parents said they'd already spent their savings on Paige's wedding and couldn't help me financially. I didn't complain because I wanted to prove I could make it on my own terms. By the time I was 30, I'd landed a position at a prestigious corporate law firm downtown and was on track to make junior partner, which I achieved 2 years ago. I lived in a modest but nice apartment, drove a reliable sedan, and was finally starting to pay down my student debt. Then our grandmother Beatrice died, and everything changed in ways I never anticipated. Grandmother Beatrice had always been different from my mother, more intellectual and independent. She'd been a professor of literature before she retired, never remarried after my grandfather died, and lived in a cozy house filled with books and art. She and I had a special connection because she valued education and critical thinking, and she never made me feel bad for being introverted or studious. When she passed away 2 years ago at 89, I grieved deeply for the loss of the one person in my family who truly understood me. At the reading of her will, I discovered she'd left me a substantial inheritance of $250,000, along with some of her books and her antique writing desk. Paige received some beautiful family jewelry worth maybe $15,000, but no cash. I could see the shock and anger on my mother's face, and Paige looked like she'd been slapped. My father's expression was calculating, and I knew immediately that this money would become a problem. For about a year and a half, things were tense, but manageable. I invested most of the inheritance in retirement accounts and kept some in savings as an emergency fund, knowing that this money represented security and freedom I'd never had before. My family made occasional comments about how generous grandmother Beatrice had been to me, always with an edge that suggested I didn't deserve it or that it should have been split equally. Then, 6 months before last Thanksgiving, my father's construction company hit a crisis. Russell had taken out loans to expand the business right before a recession hit the local housing market, and several major clients defaulted on contracts. Had also made some poor investments in property that lost value rapidly. One evening, he called me to his house for what he said was an important family meeting. When I arrived, both my parents and Paige and Derek were there, all looking somber. Russell laid out the situation with charts and spreadsheets, explaining that the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and he needed an immediate infusion of $200,000 to avoid losing everything he'd built over 30 years. Then he looked directly at me and said he was asking me to loan him the money from my inheritance, promising he'd pay me back with interest once the business recovered. The room went silent as everyone stared at me, waiting for my answer. I felt my throat tighten as I considered what to say, knowing that whatever came out of my mouth would change my relationship with my family forever. I explained carefully that the inheritance was my retirement security, that I was still paying off student loans, and that I'd worked hard to establish financial stability for the first time in my life. I said I couldn't risk losing money I might never see again, especially in a business that was already failing due to factors beyond anyone's control. I suggested he talk to banks about restructuring his loans or consider bankruptcy protection, and I offered to use my legal connections to help him find good bankruptcy attorneys. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. My father's face turned red, and he stood up, knocking his chair backward, and called me selfish and heartless. He said a real daughter would help her father in his time of need without hesitation. My mother started crying, saying I was ungrateful after everything they'd done for me, conveniently forgetting that they'd refused to help with my law school expenses. Paige joined in, calling me cold and calculating, saying I clearly cared more about money than family. Derek sat quietly, but I could see judgment in his eyes too. The argument escalated until I finally grabbed my purse and left, shaking and fighting back tears. Over the next few weeks, my phone was full of text messages alternating between guilt trips and angry accusations. My mother sent long messages about family obligations and how disappointed grandmother Beatrice would be in my selfishness, which felt particularly cruel since Beatrice had specifically chosen to give me that money. My father stopped speaking to me entirely. Then, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I received a cold text message from my mother stating that they'd decided it would be best if I didn't attend Thanksgiving dinner that year since I'd made my priorities clear. There was no discussion, no chance to defend myself, just a flat rejection that felt like a door slamming in my face. Paige posted photos on social media of the whole family gathered around the Thanksgiving table, everyone smiling and toasting with wine glasses, and the empty chair where I usually sat felt like a deliberate message. I spent that Thanksgiving alone in my apartment, ordering Chinese food and watching movies, trying to convince myself I'd made the right choice while feeling utterly abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The months that followed were some of the loneliest of my life. I threw myself into work at the law firm, taking on extra cases and staying late at the office, to avoid going home to an empty apartment where I'd have too much time to think. I started seeing a therapist to process the family trauma and the guilt I couldn't shake, even though intellectually I knew I'd done nothing wrong. My therapist helped me understand patterns of conditional love and financial manipulation in families, but knowing the psychology behind it didn't make the pain any less real. I checked Paige's social media obsessively, seeing photos of family dinners and weekend gatherings I wasn't invited to. Watching my nephew grow up in pictures instead of in person, feeling like an outsider looking in at a life I used to be part of. I grieved not just for the relationship I'd lost, but for the illusion I'd held onto that my family loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide for them. My work suffered occasionally because I'd zone out during meetings, thinking about what I could have done differently, wondering if I should have just given them the money to keep the peace, even if it meant sacrificing my own financial security and self-respect. It was a cold November afternoon, almost exactly a year after the Thanksgiving dinner I'd been excluded from, when Derek walked into my office without an appointment. My assistant tried to stop him, but he pushed past her, insisting he needed to see me immediately. I almost called security, but something about the desperation in his face made me tell my assistant it was fine, and to close the door behind him. Derek looked terrible in a way I'd never seen before. Had always been the type to dress well and maintain appearances, working in pharmaceutical sales where image mattered. But today he wore wrinkled khakis and a stained jacket, his hair uncombed and dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. He hadn't shaved in what looked like several days, and his hands shook as he sat down in the chair across from my desk without being invited. I asked him what he wanted, keeping my voice professional and cold, and he immediately started apologizing for how the family had treated me, for not standing up for me when Russell and Lorraine attacked my character, for participating in my exclusion from family events over the past year. I told him I didn't believe his apology was sincere and that he needed to tell me the real reason he was here. Because people don't show up looking like they're having a nervous breakdown unless they want something badly. Derek's composure cracked completely, and tears started streaming down his face as he leaned forward with his head in his hands. He said he and Paige were in serious trouble, worse than anyone in the family knew, and that he was the cause of all of it. He confessed that had been secretly embezzling money from Russell's construction company for the past 3 years, starting with small amounts that he told himself had payback but gradually increasing as his situation became more desperate. The total amount had stolen was $180,000, siphoned off through fake vendor invoices and padded expense reports that had gotten away with because Russell trusted him to handle a lot of the company's bookkeeping and financial paperwork. I sat there stunned, trying to process what he was telling me, while he continued his confession between sobs. Derek explained that the embezzlement had started during the pandemic when he began gambling online as a way to pass time during lockdown. What began as entertainment, betting small amounts on sports games and playing online poker, quickly became an obsession that he couldn't control. Had read articles about people winning big on sports betting and convinced himself he could be one of them, that he had a system and just needed enough capital to make it work. Instead, he lost everything he bet and kept chasing his losses, falling into the classic gambler's trap of believing the next bet would be the one that turned everything around. He lost his personal savings first, then maxed out credit cards, then started taking money from the construction company's accounts, always telling himself he'd win it back before anyone noticed. But the losses kept mounting and the debts kept growing. And now he was trapped in a nightmare that was about to destroy his entire life. The current crisis, Derek explained, was that Russell's accountant had discovered financial discrepancies during the bankruptcy proceedings. When the company started failing and Russell filed for bankruptcy protection, a forensic audit was part of the standard process, and that audit was scheduled to begin in exactly 2 weeks. The auditors would trace every transaction from the past 5 years, and Derek's fake invoices and manipulated records would be immediately obvious to trained investigators. Once the embezzlement was discovered, Derek would face criminal charges for theft and fraud. He was looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison, loss of his professional licenses, and complete destruction of his marriage and reputation. His voice broke as he talked about Paige, saying he loved her and couldn't bear the thought of her finding out what had done, couldn't imagine her visiting him in prison or trying to explain to their future children why Daddy was locked up. Derek leaned across my desk and grabbed my hands, begging me to help him. He said he needed to borrow $180,000 immediately to replace the money he'd stolen before the audit uncovered the theft. He promised he'd pay me back with interest, swore he'd get treatment for his gambling addiction, and never bet another dollar for the rest of his life. He said he'd already looked into Gamblers Anonymous meetings and found a therapist who specialized in addiction, and he'd do whatever it took to make this right if it'd just give him this one chance. He appealed to my legal knowledge, asking if there was any way to avoid prosecution if he replaced the money before the audit, if I thought the company could be convinced not to press charges if the funds were returned. His desperation was palpable, and part of me felt genuine pity for him despite everything that had happened between us. But I also felt a cold anger growing as I realized what this meant. I pulled my hands away from his grip and sat back in my chair, studying his face while my mind raced through the implications of everything he'd just told me. I said I found it interesting that he was coming to me now, after my family had spent a year treating me like I was worthless and selfish for not handing over my inheritance to save Russell's business. I pointed out that if what he was telling me was true, then my father's company hadn't failed just because of bad business decisions and market conditions, but because Derek had been systematically stealing from it for years, accelerating its decline. Derek looked down at his lap and admitted that was true, that Russell's financial problems were partly his fault, and that knowledge had been eating him alive with guilt for months. I asked him if Russell knew about the embezzlement, and Derek said no, absolutely not. Russell had no idea and would kill him if he found out. I asked if Paige knew, and again Derek said no. She thought they just had some bad luck with investments and credit card debt. she had no idea about the gambling or the theft. I told Derek I needed time to think about this and verify his story before I made any decisions. I said I'd worked too hard to build my career to risk it by getting involved in something that could be fraud or conspiracy, and I needed to protect myself legally before I did anything. Derek's face fell, and he started panicking, saying there wasn't time for due diligence. The audit was in 2 weeks, and he needed an answer now. I stood up and walked to my office door, opening it as a clear signal that this meeting was over, and told him firmly that Head waited 3 years to deal with this problem, so he could wait a few more days for me to do my research. As Derek left my office, shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. It'd been proven right that my refusal to give Russell my money wasn't the real cause of the family's financial collapse, but I also knew I was about to get pulled into a situation that would force me to make impossible choices about family loyalty versus personal integrity. I didn't give Derek an answer for 2 days, and in that time I used every legal resource available to me to verify his story. I called in a favor from a colleague who specialized in white-collar crime and asked her to discreetly check court records for Russell's bankruptcy case. Everything Derek had told me checked out. The bankruptcy petition was filed, a forensic audit was scheduled, and the timeline matched exactly what Head described. I also pulled some strings to get information about the construction company's financial situation, and the documentation showed a pattern of irregular transactions that would definitely raise red flags during any serious audit. I realized Derek was telling the truth, which meant the situation was exactly as dire as Head claimed, but I also discovered something he hadn't mentioned. The amount of money involved was actually worse than Derek admitted, because Head taken out personal loans using the company as collateral, and those loans were about to come due. The total exposure was closer to $300,000, not $180,000, and I wondered if Derek didn't know about all the debts or if Head deliberately minimized the problem when talking to me. On the evening of the second day after Derek's visit, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen on my screen in 6 months. My mother Lorraine was calling, and my hand hesitated over the phone for several rings before I finally answered. Her voice was completely different from the last time we'd spoken, warm and sweet instead of cold and judgmental, and she started by saying she'd been thinking about me constantly and feeling terrible about how things had been between us. She said the family had made a mistake in excluding me from Thanksgiving, that they'd let pride and hurt feelings get in the way of what really mattered, and she wanted to make things right. Lorraine told me she'd talked to Russell and Paige, and they all agreed that it was time to heal the rift in our family and move forward together. She invited me to Thanksgiving dinner this year, saying she'd make all my favorite dishes and we could have a fresh start, a chance to be a real family again. The timing was so obvious that I almost laughed, because there was no way this sudden reconciliation wasn't connected to Derek's desperate visit to my office. I kept my voice neutral and asked Lorraine what had changed after 6 months of complete silence, why she suddenly wanted to reconnect now. She gave a speech about the holidays, making her reflective and how life was too short to hold grudges, but she couldn't explain why this realization had happened to coincide so perfectly with Derek's crisis. I told her I'd think about the Thanksgiving invitation and get back to her, and she pushed harder, saying she really hoped I'd come because the whole family would be there and it wouldn't be the same without me. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling a familiar ache in my chest, that desperate part of me that wanted to believe my mother genuinely missed me and wanted me back in the family. But my therapist had warned me about exactly this kind of manipulation, about how toxic families reach out when they need something and disappear again once they've gotten what they want. The next morning, I received a text from my father, Russell, asking if I'd meet him for coffee, which shocked me because he hadn't spoken directly to me since the argument about the loan. I agreed to meet him that afternoon at a neutral coffee shop halfway between our locations, curious to see how Head approached the situation. Russell arrived, looking older than I remembered, more gray in his hair and new lines around his eyes, and when he hugged me in greeting, it felt stiff and performative. We ordered coffee and sat at a corner table, making awkward small talk about work and weather, until Russell finally got to the point. He said He'd done a lot of soul-searching over the past months and realized He'd been too harsh on me about the inheritance situation. He apologized for putting pressure on me and acknowledged that the business problems weren't my responsibility to fix. He got emotional as he talked about how much he missed having me in his life, how proud he was of my success as an attorney, and how Head learned that family was more important than money or business ventures. I listened to this speech and felt my guard going up because it sounded rehearsed, like Head practiced it in front of a mirror. Then Russell casually mentioned that Derek had been under a lot of stress lately, dealing with some personal financial issues. Nothing serious, but enough that it was affecting him and Paige. He said Derek had made some mistakes, but was working to get help and turn things around. And the whole family was trying to be supportive during this difficult time. Russell suggested that helping Derek now would be a way for me to prove that I was truly part of the family again, that I could look past our differences and demonstrate that family unity mattered more than past conflicts. The manipulation was so transparent that I almost called him out right there, but instead I just nodded and said I'd need to think about everything Head shared. As I drove home from that coffee shop, I felt angry tears burning behind my eyes, because my father hadn't really apologized for anything. Had just performed an apology as a way to soften me up for the real ask that was coming. Over the next week, the pressure campaign intensified from all sides. Lorraine sent me a handwritten letter about family unity and the importance of forgiveness, talking about her own mother and how much she regretted not spending more time with her before she died. The letter was filled with flowery language about love and second chances, but buried in the middle was a paragraph about how Derek was like a son to them, and they wanted to support him through his struggles. Paige texted me asking if we could meet for lunch, saying she missed her big sister and wanted to talk. When we met at a restaurant near her house, Paige actually seemed genuinely emotional, crying as she told me how much she regretted the past year and how wrong it had been for the family to exclude me. She talked about realizing through therapy that Shed always been jealous of my intelligence and success, that Shed felt inferior and had taken it out on me by siding with our parents against me. I started to feel hopeful that maybe this reconciliation was real, until Paige brought up Derek's situation, explaining that Head been struggling with gambling addiction and was getting help, but that she was worried about their future. She didn't explicitly ask me for money, but the implication was clear in every word she said. The coordinated nature of these approaches made it obvious that my family had sat down together and strategized about how to manipulate me back into their lives. Each person was playing a specific role designed to break down my defenses from a different angle. Lorraine was the emotional manipulator pulling at my heartstrings with nostalgia and guilt. Russell was the repentant father appealing to my need for his approval that had been ingrained in me since childhood. Paige was the vulnerable sister making me feel protective and responsible for her happiness. They were all working together to make me feel like refusing to help. Derek would mean I was choosing to be isolated and alone instead of being part of a loving family. The whole thing felt like a psychological warfare campaign, and I realized they must be truly desperate to put this much effort into winning me back after 6 months of treating me like I didn't exist. My therapist and I discussed these interactions in detail, and she helped me see how my family was pushing all my childhood buttons, activating old patterns where I'd been trained to sacrifice my own needs to keep peace in the family and maintain my parents' approval. I decided I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator to look into Derek's financial situation and my family's recent activities. The investigator was a former police detective who now worked private cases, and I explained that I needed a complete picture of my brother-in-law's debts and gambling activity. Within a week, he came back with a report that made Derek's confession look like just the tip of an iceberg. The investigator discovered that Derek hadn't just gambled away money and stolen from the company. Had also taken out multiple loans in Paige's name without her knowledge or consent, forging her signature on loan applications and credit card accounts. The total debt in Paige's name alone was over $70,000, completely destroying her credit score and putting her at risk of legal liability for fraud she didn't even know had been committed. The investigator's report included bank statements, loan documents, and betting records that painted a picture of addiction spiraling completely out of control. Derek had accounts with at least 6 different online gambling sites and had lost nearly $400,000 over the past 3 years, far more than the amount Head stolen from Russell's company. Head borrowed money from personal loan companies at predatory interest rates, maxed out every credit card he could get approved for, and even taken out a second mortgage on the house he shared with Paige without telling her. The forged signatures on the mortgage documents were obvious when compared to Paige's real signature, and I couldn't understand how the mortgage company hadn't caught it during their verification process. The investigator suggested they probably didn't look too closely because the property had enough equity and Derek's income looked sufficient on paper, so they pushed the paperwork through without proper due diligence. But the most shocking discovery was that my father, Russell, had known about Derek's gambling problem for at least 6 months, long before Head asked me for money to save the business. The investigator found emails between Russell and Derek, where they discussed how to hide certain transactions from the company accountant, and how to structure fake invoices so they wouldn't trigger audit flags. Russell hadn't just known about the embezzlement. Head actively helped Derek cover it up, probably hoping the business would recover, and they could quietly replace the stolen money without anyone being the wiser. This meant that Russell's bankruptcy filing was partially a strategic move to avoid investigation of the company's finances, a way to shut down the business before a deeper audit could uncover the fraud that had been happening under his watch. My father had deliberately asked me for money while knowing that Derek's theft was the real reason the company was failing, which meant every guilt trip and accusation of selfishness had been built on a foundation of lies. I dug even deeper with the investigator's help and discovered that Paige knew more than Shed let on during our lunch meeting. She didn't know about the embezzlement from the company or the full extent of Derek's gambling, but Shed known he had gambling debts for at least a year. The investigator found text messages between Paige and Derek where she confronted him about money disappearing from their joint account, and Derek had convinced her they just needed to take out a second mortgage to consolidate debt and get a fresh start. Paige had signed some documents believing they were for a home equity line of credit, not realizing Derek had forged her signature on other paperwork for additional loans and credit cards. Shed helped Derek rationalize his behavior by accepting his explanations that they'd just had some bad luck with investments, that a few bets that didn't work out weren't a big deal, that everyone struggles with money sometimes. The investigator's most disturbing finding came from security footage and audio recordings Head obtained through methods I probably shouldn't ask about too closely. My family had held at least 3 meetings at my parents' house over the past 2 weeks, where they explicitly discussed how to manipulate me into giving them money. The investigator had connections with a security company that had installed cameras in many homes in that neighborhood, and through some technical maneuvering he shouldn't have been able to access but did, he got me audio excerpts from those meetings. Listening to those recordings felt like having my heart ripped out of my chest while it was still beating. I heard my mother Lorraine suggesting a strategy she called love bombing, where they'd overwhelm me with affection and apologies to break down my resistance. Russell proposed offering me a fake partnership in a rebuilt construction company, giving me an official title and paperwork that would make me feel invested in the family business while actually having no real authority or ownership stake. The worst part of the recordings was hearing Paige's voice. During one of the family strategy sessions, Lorraine worried that I might be too smart to fall for their manipulation, and Paige laughed and said, "My sister thinks she's so smart, but she's always been easy to manipulate because she just wants to be accepted so badly." Russell agreed, saying Margot always needed our approval. She'll cave once she realizes we're serious about bringing her back into the family. Derek promised He'd handle me because it always had a soft spot for him and he knew exactly how to play on my sympathy. They discussed timing, deciding to wait until closer to Thanksgiving to extend the dinner invitation so I'd be feeling especially lonely and vulnerable during the holiday season. Every word I heard was like a knife twisting in my gut, destroying any hope. I'd secretly harbored that maybe some part of their recent outreach had been genuine. I sat alone in my office after listening to those recordings, door locked and blinds closed, and had a full panic attack. My chest felt tight and I couldn't catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to call my therapist for an emergency session. We talked for an hour about what I'd discovered, and my therapist helped me work through the acute grief I was feeling. She explained that what I was mourning wasn't just the current betrayal but the final death of the illusion that my family had ever truly loved me unconditionally. All my life, I'd believed that if I could just be good enough, smart enough, successful enough, my parents would see my worth and value me the way they valued Paige. Now I had undeniable proof that their love had always been transactional, that I was only useful to them when I had something they wanted, and that they felt no genuine affection or respect for me as a person. After Eid cried myself empty and could breathe normally again, something shifted inside me. The grief transformed into a cold clarity about what needed to happen next. I realized I'd spent my entire life trying to win approval from people who were never going to give it to me, sacrificing my own needs and boundaries to maintain relationships with people who saw me as a resource rather than a daughter and sister. I thought about my grandmother Beatrice, how she'd been independent and strong and refused to let anyone manipulate her, and I understood why she'd left me that inheritance. She'd known I would need the financial security to break free from my family's control, that the money wasn't just about retirement or comfort, but about giving me the power to protect myself from the people who should have protected me. I decided I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. I had information and leverage they didn't know I possessed, and I was going to use it to take control of this situation on my own terms. 2 days after listening to those devastating recordings, I received an unexpected phone call from my uncle Fletcher, my father's younger brother who I hadn't spoken to in years. Fletcher had always been the odd one out in the family, a high school English teacher who drove a beat-up Subaru and lived in a modest apartment instead of pursuing wealth and status like Russell had. I remembered him as kind and intelligent, someone who actually asked me about my thoughts and opinions when I was a kid instead of just telling me what to think. Fletcher and Russell had been estranged for over a decade, following some kind of business dispute I'd never fully understood, and our family didn't talk about Fletcher much except to occasionally make disparaging comments about his lack of ambition. When I answered his call, Fletcher said he'd heard through family gossip that had been cut off by Russell and Lorraine, and he wanted to reach out because he'd been through something remarkably similar 20 years earlier. We met for coffee the next day, and Fletcher looked exactly as I remembered him, just older and grayer. He still had that warm, thoughtful demeanor that had made him my favorite uncle when I was young, and he greeted me with a genuine hug that made me realize how much I'd missed having family members who didn't want anything from me. Fletcher explained that 2 decades ago, Russell had convinced him to invest his entire savings, about $50,000, into a construction project that Russell swore would double their money within a year. Fletcher had trusted his older brother and handed over the cash, only to watch the project fail and lose everything. When Fletcher asked Russell to at least pay him back the principal amount, Russell refused, claiming the investment was risky and Fletcher should have known he might lose his money. Then Russell turned the entire family against Fletcher, spreading rumors that Fletcher was bitter and jealous and trying to sabotage Russell's business out of spite. Fletcher's voice was calm and matter-of-fact as he described what followed, but I could hear old pain underneath. He told me how our grandparents had sided with Russell, how other relatives stopped inviting Fletcher to family gatherings, how he'd been essentially erased from the family for the crime of expecting his brother to honor a debt. Fletcher said he'd spent years angry and hurt, trying to prove his side of the story and win back family relationships, before finally accepting that Russell was never going to take responsibility and the family was never going to hold him accountable. He rebuilt his life without them, made new friends, found fulfillment in teaching, and eventually reached a place of peace with the estrangement. But had never forgotten the lessons he learned about Russell's character, and when he heard I was going through something similar, he knew he had to reach out to warn me. Fletcher said he'd been quietly documenting Russell's questionable business practices for years, partly out of continued anger, but mostly to protect himself in case Russell ever tried to come after him legally or financially. He had copies of contracts, financial statements, correspondence, and other documents that showed a pattern of Russell taking advantage of people and refusing to honor his commitments. Fletcher offered to share this documentation with me, saying it might be useful if I needed to protect myself legally from whatever Russell was planning. He also offered to come with me to any family meetings or Thanksgiving dinner, saying I shouldn't have to face them alone after what they'd done. I felt tears welling up at the kindness of this gesture from someone who had every reason to want nothing to do with our family drama, and I accepted his offer gratefully. As we talked more, Fletcher told me something about my grandmother Beatrice that I'd never known. He said that before she died, Beatrice had confided in him that she was worried about me, that she could see how Russell and Lorraine treated me differently from Paige, and how that differential treatment was affecting my self-esteem and sense of worth. Beatrice had specifically structured her will to leave me the larger inheritance, because she knew Russell was financially irresponsible and would try to get his hands on any money she left to her grandchildren. Shed told Fletcher that she trusted me to be wise with the money, and that she hoped it would give me the security to stand up to my father when the time came. Learning this made me cry in the middle of the coffee shop because it meant Beatrice had seen what was happening and had tried to protect me even after her death, and I felt validated in a way I desperately needed. Fletcher introduced me to a friend of his named Colette. A financial forensic accountant Wad helped him document Russell's business improprieties over the years. Colette agreed to review the information the private investigator had gathered about Derek's embezzlement and my family's financial situation, and she worked quickly to compile everything into a comprehensive report. What she discovered was even worse than it imagined. Russell hadn't just helped Derek cover up the embezzlement, had been running his own schemes on the side, filing false insurance claims for equipment that was never stolen and underreporting income to avoid taxes. The construction company's bankruptcy was partly legitimate financial trouble, and partly a strategic move to avoid regulatory scrutiny that was starting to come his way. Colette estimated that Russell had committed at least $200,000 worth of insurance fraud over the past 5 years, along with tax evasion that could result in significant penalties and possible criminal charges. Colette explained that if I reported everything to the authorities, both Russell and Derek could face serious criminal charges, but she advised me to be careful about how I proceeded because family prosecutions were always messy, and I needed to protect myself legally. She suggested that I could use this information as leverage to force my family to leave me alone and stop their manipulation campaign, or I could go to the authorities and let the justice system handle it, but either way I needed to document everything carefully and possibly wear a wire if I met with them again. The idea of wearing a wire to Thanksgiving dinner with my family seemed surreal and depressing, but Colette said it was the smartest way to protect myself and get evidence of any admissions or threats they might make. Fletcher agreed to be there with me as a witness, and suddenly I had a plan forming in my mind, a way to take control of this nightmare situation instead of being a passive victim of my family's schemes. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and gray, matching my mood as I got ready to face my family for the first time in over a year. It accepted my mother's invitation 3 days earlier, calling her back and saying it'd decided that family was too important to let past conflicts get in the way of healing. Lorraine had been thrilled, gushing about how happy she was and how special this Thanksgiving would be now that the whole family would be together again. It asked if I could bring Uncle Fletcher since he was family too, and it'd been spending time with him lately, and there was a long pause before Lorraine agreed in a tight voice, clearly unhappy about Fletcher's inclusion but unable to refuse without showing her hand. I'd spent the previous day with Colette getting fitted with a discreet recording device, a tiny microphone that looked like a button on my shirt, and transmitted to a recording device in my purse. The whole setup felt like something from a spy movie, and I practiced speaking naturally while wearing it so I wouldn't sound stiff or nervous during dinner. Fletcher picked me up at my apartment at noon, and we drove together to my childhood home in the suburbs. He could see I was nervous, hands clenched in my lap and breathing shallow, and he reminded me that I didn't have to go through with this if it felt like too much. I told him I needed to do it, needed to face them with the truth, and give them a chance to come clean before I made any decisions about involving authorities. As we pulled up to the house, I saw Lorraine had put up elaborate Thanksgiving decorations, with a harvest wreath on the door and seasonal flowers in planters on the porch. The house looked exactly as it had during every Thanksgiving of my childhood, warm and welcoming from the outside while hiding all the dysfunction that happened within its walls. Lorraine opened the door before we could knock, throwing her arms around me in an exaggerated hug and telling me how wonderful I looked, how much Shed missed me, how grateful she was that I'd come. Russell appeared behind her, shaking my hand formally and welcoming Fletcher with barely concealed coldness. I could see the calculation in my father's eyes as he assessed why Fletcher was there and what it might mean for their plans. Paige came running from the kitchen and hugged me tightly, and for just a moment, I almost believed the emotion in her embrace was genuine before I remembered the recordings where Shed laughed about manipulating me. Derek hung back near the dining room, looking guilty and terrified, unable to meet my eyes. The house smelled amazing, with turkey and stuffing and all my favorite dishes that Lorraine had promised to make. The dining room table was set beautifully with the good china and crystal glasses, candles flickering, and a centerpiece of autumn flowers that must have cost a fortune. Everything was perfect on the surface, a Norman Rockwell painting of American family togetherness, while underneath lurked lies and manipulation and criminal activity. We sat down to dinner and everyone was on their absolute best behavior, passing dishes politely and asking about each other's lives with careful interest. Lorraine asked about my work at the law firm, and I gave vague answers about cases I was handling while watching her pretend to care about my career that she'd never shown any interest in before. Russell made a toast about family being the most important thing in life, about how blood ties were stronger than any disagreement or misunderstanding, and everyone raised their glasses while I smiled and sipped my wine. We went around the table sharing what we were thankful for, and each person mentioned me specifically, saying how grateful they were to have me back in the family. Paige teared up as she talked about missing her big sister and regretting the lost time between us. Derek thanked me for being willing to hear him out and for my compassion. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed we were actually healing our rifts, that my family genuinely wanted me back in their lives. After dinner, Lorraine served pumpkin pie and coffee, while Russell suggested we all move to his study to talk privately. This was clearly the moment they'd been building toward, the real purpose of this whole elaborate performance. The family crowded into the study, Russell sitting behind his desk like a patriarch about to deliver important wisdom, while Lorraine perched on the arm of his chair, and Paige and Derek sat together on the leather couch. Fletcher and I took the remaining chairs, and I could feel the recording device against my chest, capturing every word that was about to be said. Russell started with more speeches about reflection and growth, about how Head learned from his mistakes and wanted to be better. Then he pivoted to what he called Derek's situation, explaining that Derek had come to him recently with a very serious problem that threatened the entire family's well-being. Derek launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about his gambling addiction, how it had started innocently but spiraled out of control, how ashamed he was of his weakness and the mistakes Head made. He talked about hitting rock bottom and realizing he needed help, about starting recovery and committing to change. It would have been moving if I didn't know he was lying about attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings and getting therapy. Derek explained that Head borrowed money from various sources to cover his gambling debts, and now those debts were coming due and threatening his marriage and future. He claimed the total amount needed was $225,000, a figure they'd clearly chosen because it was just under what they thought I had liquid in my inheritance. Russell presented paperwork showing a detailed repayment plan, with Derek committing to pay me back over 10 years with interest, everything official and legal looking to make me believe this was a legitimate loan rather than a bailout for criminal activity. The pressure intensified as each family member took turns making their case. Lorraine cried and begged me to help save the family, saying that if Derek went to prison or lost everything, it would destroy Paige and tear the family apart forever. She appealed to my role as the oldest daughter, saying I had a responsibility to protect my little sister from this heartbreak. Paige pleaded with me directly, holding my hands and saying she couldn't survive losing Derek, that Shed already lost so much time with me and couldn't bear to lose her husband too. She painted a picture of herself as a victim who'd done nothing wrong and would suffer terribly if I didn't step in to save her. Russell framed the whole thing as an investment in family unity, suggesting that helping Derek now would prove I'd truly forgiven them and was committed to being part of the family again. The manipulation was so thick I could taste it, and I saw Fletcher's jaw tighten as he listened to them work me over. Derek got down on his knees in front of my chair, literally begging with tears streaming down his face. He said I was his last hope, his only chance at redemption and rebuilding his life. He promised he was a changed man who'd made terrible mistakes but deserved a second chance. He appealed to my compassion and my legal expertise, suggesting I could be a hero who saved the family from destruction with my wisdom and generosity. He said he knew I was smart and successful and had resources they didn't have, and he was willing to do anything, sign anything, commit to any terms I wanted if I'd just help him this one time. The performance was impressive in its desperation, and I realized they'd been practicing these speeches and coordinating their approach carefully to hit me from every emotional angle. I stayed calm throughout their presentation, asking careful questions to draw out more details, while the recording device captured everything. I asked Derek to explain exactly what debts needed to be paid and when, and he stumbled through answers that didn't quite match the numbers Russell had presented. I asked how much Paige knew about the situation, and Paige admitted she didn't actually know all the details, just that Derek needed help and she trusted him to be honest with her. Russell accidentally contradicted Derek's timeline about when the gambling had started, catching himself mid-sentence but not before revealing he knew more than had admitted. Lorraine got impatient with my questions and snapped at me to just decide whether I was going to help or not, saying all this talking was just delaying the inevitable. The masks were starting to slip, as they grew frustrated with my refusal to immediately agree. When I still didn't commit to giving them the money, the warmth evaporated from the room like someone had opened a window in winter. Russell's tone shifted from conciliatory to threatening, as he reminded me of my obligations to the family, saying that real family members help each other without asking so many questions. Lorraine accused me of being vindictive and holding grudges, of using this situation to punish them for last year's Thanksgiving exclusion. Paige said that if I refused to help Derek, it would prove I'd never really loved any of them, and had just come to Thanksgiving to gloat about having money while they suffered. Derek's desperation turned to anger as he said I was being selfish and heartless, just like they'd said last year, and that I was hoarding my inheritance when I should be using it to help family. The true nature of their feelings became crystal clear as their frustration boiled over into accusations and attacks. I pulled out my phone calmly and placed it on Russell's desk, then tapped the screen to play the recordings the private investigator had obtained of their strategy meetings. The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of their own voices playing back at them, discussing how to manipulate me, laughing about how easy I was to fool, planning exactly what they were going to say to break down my resistance. I watched their faces as they heard themselves calling me stupid and gullible, as Lorraine's voice came through the speaker saying Margot always needed our approval, shell cave. Paige's face went white as her own laughter played back, the moment where Shed said my sister thinks she's so smart, but she's always been easy to manipulate. Russell turned bright red, a vein throbbing in his forehead as he realized they'd been caught. Derek looked like he was going to be sick, standing up from his kneeling position and backing away from me like it'd suddenly become dangerous. Russell exploded in rage, standing up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. He demanded to know how it'd gotten those recordings, accusing me of illegal surveillance and invasion of privacy, threatening to sue me for violating their rights. His anger was pure deflection, trying to make me the villain for exposing their manipulation instead of acknowledging what they'd done. Lorraine grabbed my phone and tried to delete the recording, but Fletcher intercepted her, taking the phone from her hands and giving it back to me while telling her calmly that making things worse wouldn't help anyone. Paige sat frozen on the couch, staring at Derek with an expression of dawning horror as the full implications of what they'd been caught doing sank in. Derek attempted to leave the study, but I stood up and blocked the door, telling him firmly that we weren't done talking, and if he left now, I'd have no choice but to go straight to the authorities with everything I knew. I pulled out a folder ID brought with me, and spread documents across Russell's desk, each page representing another piece of evidence ID gathered over the past weeks. I laid out the private investigator's findings about Derek's embezzlement of $180,000 from the construction company, complete with bank statements and forged invoices. I showed them proof that Derek had taken out loans in Paige's name without her consent, forging her signature on loan applications and credit agreements that left her liable for debts she didn't know existed. I presented documentation of the second mortgage Derek had taken out on their house, comparing Paige's real signature to the forged one on the mortgage paperwork. Finally, I revealed evidence of Russell's insurance fraud and tax evasion, the fake claims and underreported income that Colette had helped me document. Each piece of paper I laid down was like a bomb going off, and I watched my family's faces cycle through shock, denial, fear, and rage. Paige found her voice first, turning to Derek with tears streaming down her face and demanding he tell her the truth about everything. She asked how much money had really stolen, how many loans had taken out in her name, whether anything had told her over the past few years had been honest. Derek tried to minimize the damage, claiming the amounts weren't as bad as the documents suggested, saying Head planned to tell her everything once he figured out how to fix it. But Paige wasn't buying his excuses anymore, and she started yelling at him about the house, their credit, the future they were supposed to be building together. She realized that the foreclosure notices they'd been receiving weren't mistakes like Derek had told her, that their home was actually about to be taken away because Derek had mortgaged it to pay gambling debts. Her entire life was revealed to be built on lies, and watching her world shatter in real time was both satisfying and deeply sad. Paige turned on our parents next, asking through her tears if they'd known what Derek was doing. Russell and Lorraine exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to calculate what they could get away with denying versus what I could prove. I saved them the trouble by pulling out more documents, emails between Russell and Derek, discussing how to hide transactions and structure fake paperwork to avoid detection. I showed Paige proof that Russell had known about Derek's gambling for months before the bankruptcy filing, that had helped Derek cover up the embezzlement in hopes the business would recover and they could quietly replace the stolen money. Lorraine had known too, I revealed, producing text messages where Shed told Russell that keeping Paige in the dark was for her own good, that she couldn't handle the stress of knowing the truth. Paige looked at our parents like she was seeing them for the first time, realizing they'd been lying to her just as much as Derek had, treating her like a child who needed to be protected from reality instead of an adult who deserved to know what was happening in her own life. I decided it was time to address the deeper family dysfunction that had led to this moment, and I turned to Russell and Lorraine with years of accumulated pain rising to the surface. I told them about growing up always feeling like I wasn't good enough, like nothing I accomplished mattered because I wasn't the right kind of daughter who fit their image of what a woman should be. I pointed out how they'd praised Paige for being pretty and social while treating my intelligence and ambition like character defects to be tolerated rather than strengths to be celebrated. I explained how their favoritism had damaged both of us, leaving me with a desperate need for approval that made me vulnerable to manipulation, while teaching Paige that her value came from pleasing others rather than developing her own identity. I told them about the inheritance from grandmother Beatrice, how Shed specifically structured it to protect me from their control because Shed'd seen the patterns they were too selfish or oblivious to recognize. Lorraine finally broke down completely, her careful facade crumbling as she admitted things I'd never expected to hear. She said Shed always resented me for being so much like Beatrice, intelligent and independent in ways that made Lorraine feel inadequate about her own choices. She confessed that Shed felt judged by both Beatrice and me for not going to college, for choosing to be a real estate agent and mother instead of pursuing a career that required advanced education. She revealed that Shed pushed Russell to favor Paige partially as revenge against Beatrice and me, a way to assert her own values and prove that being traditionally feminine and people-pleasing was just as valid as being smart and ambitious. This admission stunned me because I'd never judged Lorraine for her choices, had never thought less of her for not going to college, but Shed projected her own insecurities onto me and turned them into resentment that shaped how Shed treated me my entire life. Russell, however, showed no such vulnerability or self-awareness. He refused to take real responsibility for anything, instead launching into a rant about business pressures and economic factors beyond his control. He blamed the recession, bad luck, Derek's weakness, everyone and everything except his own choices and behavior. When I confronted him directly about the insurance fraud and tax evasion, he dismissed it as common business practices that everyone engaged in to stay competitive. He still tried to justify asking me for money, claiming that a truly good daughter would help her father without asking questions, that family loyalty should trump any concerns about legality or fairness. Russell's narcissism was on full display as he revealed himself to be completely unrepentant, believing he was entitled to whatever resources his children possessed, because he was the patriarch and they owed him for the privilege of being born into his family. Derek, cornered and desperate, finally admitted that things were even worse than had confessed when he came to my office. The debts weren't just from regular gambling sites but from illegal bookies who were now threatening him for non-payment. Had received photos of his house and car with captions about what a shame it would be if something happened to them. Messages that made clear these were dangerous people who didn't care about his excuses. Had put Paige's physical safety at risk along with their financial security, and this revelation made Paige stand up and scream at him to get out, to leave her house and her life and never come back. Derek tried to grab her arms and apologize, but Paige shoved him away with a strength I'd never seen from my usually passive sister, and Fletcher stepped between them to make sure Derek didn't try to restrain her. Paige turned to me with desperate eyes, asking what she should do, how she could fix this nightmare that her life had become. It was the first time in our lives that Shed looked to me as the wise one, the person with answers, instead of the difficult sister who caused problems. I told her honestly that there were no easy fixes, that she needed to consult with a divorce attorney immediately to protect herself from Derek's debts, that she might need to file police reports about the forged signatures to avoid being held liable for loans she didn't authorize. I offered to help her find good lawyers and walk her through the legal process, but I made clear I wouldn't be giving her or Derek any money to bail them out of consequences they'd created. Paige nodded, accepting this in a way she never could have before her illusions were shattered, and I saw her starting the painful process of growing up and taking responsibility for her own life. I stood in the center of Russell's study, surrounded by the wreckage of my family's denial and dysfunction, and delivered my ultimatum. I told them they had 48 hours to decide whether they'd cooperate with authorities voluntarily or whether I'd report everything to the FBI and IRS myself. I explained that if they came forward on their own and took responsibility, there was a chance they could negotiate plea deals and reduced sentences, but if I had to be the one to expose them, prosecutors would be less sympathetic. I offered to help them navigate the legal system using my professional connections, to make sure they got good attorneys and fair treatment, but I made absolutely clear I would not give them $1 to avoid consequences for crimes they'd committed. I gave them until Saturday at noon to let me know their decision, and if I didn't hear from them, I'd assume they'd chosen to face prosecution the hard way. Russell stormed out of his own study, refusing to accept my terms or acknowledge he'd done anything wrong. He shouted back at me from the hallway that I was destroying the family out of spite, that I'd regret this vindictive choice for the rest of my life. Lorraine followed him, torn between her husband and her daughter, calling after Russell to wait and talk about this rationally while also shooting me looks of pure hatred. Paige stayed behind with me and Fletcher, collapsing into a chair and sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Derek tried to approach her, to comfort her or apologize again, but she told him to leave without looking at him, and after a long moment he walked out of the house without another word. The Thanksgiving dinner sat abandoned on the dining room table, food getting cold and candles burning down, a perfect metaphor for the family warmth that had been fake from the start. Fletcher drove Paige to a friend's house where she'd be staying temporarily, away from Derek and the home they'd shared that was about to be foreclosed on. Before she got out of the car, Paige turned to me and apologized for how she'd treated me growing up, for participating in the favoritism and enjoying her status as the golden child. She admitted she'd always known she was the favorite, but had reveled in it, instead of questioning why our parents treated us so differently. She confessed that she'd felt inferior to my intelligence and accomplishments her entire life, that her mean girl behavior toward me had been rooted in jealousy and insecurity. Their parents had pitted us against each other, she realized, teaching us that love was a competition where only one daughter could win. I hugged her and told her we could work on rebuilding our relationship slowly if she wanted to, but it had to be based on honesty and respect, instead of the toxic patterns we'd grown up with. Paige agreed and thanked me for trying to protect her even when she didn't deserve my concern. The 48 hours passed with no contact from my parents or Derek, and on Saturday morning I made the calls I'd known were inevitable. I reported Derek's embezzlement to the FBI's white-collar crime division, providing all the documentation I'd gathered, including the forged signatures and fake invoices. I filed a complaint with the IRS about Russell's tax evasion and insurance fraud, sending them the evidence Colette had compiled, showing years of underreported income and false claims. Within a week, both Derek and Russell were arrested. Derek at his workplace where his colleagues watched him being led out in handcuffs, Russell at home early in the morning before he could contact an attorney. The arrests made local news because Russell's construction company had been a fixture in Portland for decades, and the story became a scandal about a respected businessman who'd been running schemes while projecting an image of success and integrity. Lorraine called me after the arrests, and the venom in her voice was shocking even after everything I'd learned about her true feelings. She screamed that I'd destroyed the family, that I'd ruined Russell and Derek's lives out of nothing but vindictiveness and cruelty. She said it was all my fault for refusing to help when I had the money to make everything right, that I could have saved everyone from this outcome if I'd just been generous and forgiving. She told me I was dead to her, that she had no daughter named Margot anymore, and that she hoped I'd be proud of myself when Russell went to prison and Derek's life was destroyed. Other relatives started calling and texting with similar messages. Uncles and aunts and cousins who'd heard Lorraine's version of events and believed I'd made false accusations to get revenge for being excluded from last year's Thanksgiving. The extended family turned against me just like they'd turned against Fletcher 20 years earlier, proving that the dysfunction ran deep through multiple generations. The legal process ground forward slowly over the following months. Derek pleaded guilty to embezzlement, fraud, and forgery in exchange for a reduced sentence of 3 years in minimum security prison and 5 years probation afterward. He lost his pharmaceutical sales license and any chance of working in that industry again. His guilty plea helped prosecutors build their case against Russell, showing a pattern of fraud within the construction company that Russell had known about and facilitated. Paige filed for divorce before Derek went to prison, and the proceedings were complicated by untangling the debts and determining which ones she was legally responsible for versus which ones resulted from Derek's forgeries. She had to declare bankruptcy to discharge the loans Derek had taken out in her name, and her credit was destroyed for years to come, but at least she wasn't personally liable for hundreds of thousands in debt she'd never agreed to take on. Russell fought his charges, hiring expensive attorneys and insisting he'd done nothing wrong, forcing the case to trial. I had to testify against my father, sitting in the witness box and answering questions about the evidence I'd gathered and what Russell had told me about Derek's embezzlement. Russell stared at me from the defense table with pure hatred in his eyes, and I forced myself to stay calm and professional while my stomach churned with anxiety. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the stress of it affected my work performance at the law firm. I had panic attacks before each day of testimony, spent sleepless nights worrying about whether I'd done the right thing, questioned myself constantly about whether I should have just given them the money, and walked away from the whole mess. My therapist worked overtime helping me cope with the emotional toll of publicly testifying against my own father, reminding me that protecting myself and upholding the law wasn't betrayal, it was survival. The jury found Russell guilty on multiple counts of fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and tax evasion. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution of over $300,000 that he didn't have and would probably never be able to pay. The family home was seized and sold to partially cover the restitution, and Lorraine was left with almost nothing, having to move into a small apartment and get a job at a retail store to support herself. She faced no criminal charges because prosecutors couldn't prove she'd been actively involved in the fraud beyond knowing about it. But she lost her comfortable lifestyle and social status. Some of the relatives who'd condemned me after the arrests eventually learned the full truth and reached out to apologize. But by then, I'd realized I didn't want relationships with people who'd been so quick to believe the worst about me without hearing my side of the story. Uncle Fletcher stayed by my side throughout the entire ordeal, attending the trial with me every single day and taking me out for dinner afterward to decompress. He became the family I'd needed all along, someone who supported me without expecting anything in return, who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Fletcher introduced me to his friends, who welcomed me into their circle without judgment, and I started building a chosen family of people who actually cared about my well-being. My therapist helped me understand that hitting this rock bottom was necessary for my healing, that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought mattered to discover what actually holds value. I grieved for the family I'd wanted but never had, mourning not just the current loss but the lifetime of conditional love and manipulation that had finally come to an end. The trial ended in late October, just weeks before Thanksgiving would roll around again. Derek was already serving his sentence. Russell was awaiting transfer to his assigned federal facility, and my family as I'd known it had completely disintegrated. I thought about spending another Thanksgiving alone, ordering takeout and pretending the holiday didn't matter. But Fletcher had other ideas. He suggested I host Thanksgiving at my apartment this year, inviting the people who'd supported me through the nightmare of the past year, creating a celebration based on genuine connection instead of obligation and performance. I agreed hesitantly, not sure I could handle the emotional weight of the holiday after everything that had happened, but Fletcher assured me it would be healing to reclaim Thanksgiving as something positive. I sent invitations to a small group, Fletcher, Colette, the forensic accountant, who'd become a real friend during our work together. My therapist who'd gone above and beyond her professional duties to help me survive. A few colleagues from the law firm had been supportive when it had to take time off for the trial, and my boyfriend Marcus, who I'd started dating a few months earlier, and how'd proven himself patient and understanding through my family chaos. I also invited Paige, uncertain whether she'd come but wanting to extend the olive branch. To my surprise, she accepted, saying she'd like to try rebuilding our relationship if I was willing. On Thanksgiving morning, I cleaned my apartment and prepared food with Fletcher's help. Nothing elaborate like Lorraine's productions, but honest cooking that we made together while talking and laughing. My guests arrived in the late afternoon, and my apartment filled with warmth that felt completely different from the forced cheer of last year's Thanksgiving at my parents' house. These people were here because they wanted to be, not because they were performing for each other or angling for something. Colette brought an amazing sweet potato casserole and regaled us with stories from her work as a forensic accountant, making us laugh with tales of creative fraud schemes she'd uncovered. My therapist, in a rare social appearance with a client, shared wisdom about resilience and healing that felt appropriate for the occasion. Marcus helped me serve the turkey, and I felt grateful for his steady presence in my life. The way Head never pressured me to rush through my grief or pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. When Paige arrived, I could see Shed changed in the months since our family imploded. Shed cut her hair short and dressed more casually, less of the put-together perfection that Lorraine had always demanded. She brought a pie Shed made herself, admitting it probably wasn't very good because she was still learning to cook without following recipes exactly like our mother had insisted. We hugged, and it felt real in a way our embraces never had before, without the undercurrent of competition and resentment that had poisoned our relationship for decades. During dinner, we went around the table sharing what we were grateful for, and Paige said she was thankful for me, for showing her what real strength looked like, and for not giving up on her even when she didn't deserve my loyalty. I teared up and told her I was grateful she was giving us a chance to know each other as adults, to build something honest instead of replicating the toxic dynamics we'd grown up with. The conversation flowed naturally through the evening, and I realized this was what Thanksgiving was supposed to feel like: relaxed and genuine, with people who saw your flaws and chose to be there anyway. Fletcher proposed a toast to chosen family, to the relationships we build based on respect and authenticity rather than obligation and blood ties. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt something shift inside me, a release of the desperate need for my parents' approval that had driven so many of my choices. I didn't need Russell and Lorraine to validate my worth or confirm that I mattered, because I had evidence all around me that I was valued and loved by people whose opinions actually counted. After dinner, Paige pulled me aside to talk privately. She said she wanted to thank me for exposing Derek's lies, even though it had been devastating at the time. She realized now that I'd saved her life by revealing the truth before things got even worse, before Derek's debts to dangerous people put her in physical danger, or before she wasted more years married to someone who saw her as a cover for his addiction, rather than a partner. She told me she was in therapy working on herself, learning to build an identity beyond being the pretty, agreeable daughter who always did what she was told. She'd gotten a job as a receptionist at a dental office, nothing glamorous but enough to support herself, and she was slowly rebuilding her credit and confidence. She asked if we could meet regularly for coffee or lunch, and I agreed with the understanding that it would take time to build real trust between us. She accepted those terms, and I saw in her eyes that she understood she'd have to prove herself through actions, not just words. Over the following months, Paige and I developed a cautious relationship built on honesty, instead of the roles we'd been assigned as children. We met twice a month, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes for longer conversations where she'd ask my advice about practical matters like budgeting and career planning. I helped her think through what she wanted her life to look like instead of just accepting whatever came her way, and I watched her slowly become more confident in expressing opinions and making decisions. She never asked me for money, understanding that our new relationship had to be free of financial entanglement, and I respected her for working hard to support herself despite the challenges. We talked about our childhood, processing the ways our parents' favoritism had damaged both of us. Her by making her dependent on external validation, and me by teaching me my worth was contingent on being useful. Lorraine eventually wrote me a letter, not asking for anything but taking responsibility for her role in the family dysfunction. She acknowledged that Shed enabled Russell's behavior, that Shed treated me differently from Paige in ways that were unfair and harmful, that her own insecurities had driven her to undermine my confidence rather than celebrating my achievements. The letter was more honest than anything Lorraine had ever said to me in person, and while it didn't erase the decades of hurt, it meant something that Shed finally admitted the truth. I wrote back accepting her apology, but explaining that I needed to maintain firm boundaries around our relationship, that I couldn't risk being pulled back into toxic patterns just because Shed had a moment of clarity. We met once for coffee, a stilted conversation where we acknowledged the past and agreed to very limited contact going forward. I felt no obligation to have a close relationship with her just because Shed given birth to me, and that acceptance was surprisingly freeing. My career at the law firm actually benefited from how ID handled the family situation. The senior partners were impressed by my ability to navigate complex legal and ethical issues while maintaining my professional integrity, and I was promoted to senior partner 6 months after Russell's trial ended. I started specializing in family financial law and fraud cases, using my personal experience to help others who were dealing with financial manipulation by relatives. I found deep purpose in protecting people from the kinds of schemes my family had tried to pull on me, and my clients appreciated working with someone who understood the emotional complexity of taking legal action against family members. The work was challenging but meaningful, and I felt like I'd finally found a way to channel all the pain from my past into something constructive. My healing journey continued through consistent therapy, where I worked on unpacking decades of codependency and people-pleasing behaviors. I learned about narcissistic family systems and how growing up in one had shaped my relationships and self-perception in ways I hadn't recognized. I joined a support group for adults estranged from their families of origin, and hearing other people's stories helped me feel less alone in my experience. I discovered that many intelligent, successful people struggled with family dysfunction, that having toxic parents didn't mean something was wrong with me. I also learned to recognize red flags in relationships, setting boundaries with people who tried to manipulate or take advantage of me, no longer willing to sacrifice my well-being to keep peace or win approval from people who didn't value me. Marcus and I grew closer as I healed, and our relationship deepened in ways that wouldn't have been possible before I'd done the work to understand myself. He respected my boundaries without making me feel guilty for having them, supported my goals without trying to change me, and loved me for exactly who I was rather than who he wanted me to be. We took our time building something real instead of rushing into commitment before we were ready, and I appreciated his patience with my trust issues and emotional processing. A year after that first Thanksgiving I'd hosted, Marcus proposed, and I said yes, knowing that I was choosing to build a family with someone who saw me clearly and loved what he saw. As the second Thanksgiving since my family's implosion approached, I planned another gathering at my now slightly larger apartment that Marcus and I shared. I invited all the people who'd become my chosen family, plus a few additions, including 2 colleagues from the support group, who'd become friends, and a neighbor who'd helped me through some difficult days. The group was bigger this year, more diverse, full of people who'd formed genuine connections based on shared values and mutual support. Paige came again, this time bringing her new boyfriend, a kind man who worked as a carpenter and treated her with respect. I'd never seen Derek show her. She'd grown so much over the past year, and I felt proud of her courage in rebuilding her life from scratch. We gathered around my table, and the conversation was rich, with real stories and authentic laughter. No one was performing or hiding parts of themselves or calculating what they could get from anyone else. When we shared gratitude, I talked about losing the family I thought I had but gaining the family I actually needed. About learning that blood ties don't create obligation to accept abuse or manipulation. I spoke about my grandmother Beatrice, and how her inheritance had given me more than financial security, how it had provided the foundation for independence and freedom that allowed me to break generational patterns of dysfunction. I thanked everyone present for showing me what healthy relationships looked like, for teaching me that love shouldn't require sacrificing my boundaries or denying my worth. Fletcher raised his glass and offered a toast about the courage it takes to walk away from toxicity. about choosing peace over the illusion of family unity. He acknowledged that the path I'd taken had been painful but necessary, that protecting myself from people who'd hurt me wasn't selfish or cruel but an act of self-respect that more people should have the strength to take. Everyone clinked glasses, and I looked around at faces filled with genuine affection and respect, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude for the community I'd built from the ashes of my broken family. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, and I leaned into him, secure in the knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged. Later that evening, as the party wound down and guests started leaving, Paige stayed behind to help clean up. She told me she'd been thinking a lot about our childhood and the different paths our lives had taken. She said she used to think she'd won because she was the favorite, because she got more attention and approval from our parents. But now she realized I was the lucky one. I'd been forced to develop independence and strength because I couldn't rely on parental approval, while she'd been kept weak and dependent, unprepared to handle real life without someone telling her what to do and who to be. She thanked me again for not abandoning her when everything fell apart, for giving her a chance to grow into someone she could be proud of, instead of just someone who made others happy at her own expense. I hugged my sister and told her we were both doing the best we could with the tools we'd been given, that healing from childhood trauma was a lifelong process, and we were both works in progress. I said I was proud of her for doing the hard work of therapy and self-reflection, for building a life based on her own values, instead of trying to live up to impossible standards set by parents who'd never been capable of unconditional love. Paige cried and said she hoped one day to have a daughter of her own and to be nothing like Lorraine, to create a home where children felt valued for who they were instead of what they could provide. I told her I believed she could do exactly that, and seeing her transformation gave me hope that we could break the cycles we'd inherited and build something better for the next generation. As I stood at my window watching the last guests leave, Marcus came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. He asked how I was feeling, if the day had been too emotionally overwhelming, or if I was okay. I told him honestly that I felt more okay than I'd been in years, maybe in my entire life. I explained that for the first time, Thanksgiving had been about genuine gratitude instead of performing gratitude while hiding dysfunction. I'd lost the family I'd grown up with, but I'd gained something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that I deserved real love and the courage to build a life around that truth. Marcus kissed the top of my head and said he was proud of me, and those words meant more coming from him than any approval from Russell ever would have. I thought back to that cold November afternoon when Derek had walked into my office looking desperate, and I realized that moment had changed the trajectory of my entire life. If he hadn't confessed his embezzlement, if he hadn't triggered the chain of events that exposed my family's lies and manipulation, I might have spent decades more trying to win approval from people incapable of giving it. I might have eventually caved and given them money just to be accepted, sacrificing my financial security and self-respect for the illusion of family unity. Instead, I'd been forced to choose between enabling their dysfunction or protecting myself, and I'd chosen myself. That choice had cost me the family I'd thought I had, but it had given me something far more precious: freedom from the desperate need for their approval, peace from constantly trying to be good enough, and the opportunity to build authentic relationships with people who valued me. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still days when I felt grief for the parents I'd needed, but never had, the childhood I deserved but didn't receive. But those days came less frequently now, and when they did, I had healthy coping mechanisms and supportive people to help me through them. I'd learned that family wasn't defined by blood but by choice, by who showed up when things got hard, and who celebrated your successes without jealousy or resentment. I'd discovered that setting boundaries didn't make me cold or selfish, but made me someone who respected herself enough to demand respect from others. Most importantly, I'd realized that my worth wasn't determined by whether my parents loved me, but by whether I loved myself enough to protect myself from people who'd hurt me. As Thanksgiving night drew to a close and Marcus and I finished cleaning up, I sat down on my couch and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through photos from the evening, images of real smiles and genuine connection that looked nothing like the perfectly staged photos Lorraine used to post from family gatherings. I thought about sharing one on social media but decided against it, realizing I no longer needed external validation or to prove anything to anyone. The people in those photos knew what they meant to me, and that was enough. I put my phone away and curled up next to Marcus, feeling deeply grateful for the long, painful journey that had brought me to this moment of hard-won peace. The story of my family's betrayal and my escape from their manipulation wasn't the kind of tale with a neat, happy ending where everything was resolved and everyone reconciled. Russell was still in prison. Derek was halfway through his sentence. Lorraine was struggling financially, and our extended family remained fractured. But I'd built a life I was proud of, surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared about me, and broken free from patterns of dysfunction that had held me back for decades. I'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you, even when those people are family, even when walking away means facing judgment and accusations from others who don't understand. I'd discovered that freedom comes when you stop seeking approval from people who never valued you and start building your worth on a foundation of self-respect and authentic connection. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself? Have you dealt with relatives who only reached out when they needed something? Drop a comment below sharing your experience, because I'd love to hear your stories, and I know others watching could use the validation that they're not alone in dealing with family dysfunction. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about overcoming toxic relationships and building healthier lives. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to set boundaries with family, that choosing yourself isn't selfish, but necessary. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this community where we can talk honestly about difficult family situations without judgment. I hope this Thanksgiving season, wherever you are and whoever you're with, you find genuine connection and peace. Remember that you deserve relationships built on respect and authenticity, and it's never too late to start creating the family and life you truly want. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.